So, we left off in the last lecture by asking, what is it that sent the disciples and the followers of Jesus from being in hiding and terrified and not wanting to be seen as having anything to do with Jesus to going out and proclaiming Jesus with utter abandon? Well, if you haven't read the story yet, spoiler alert, Jesus raises from the dead. Now, again, the movement is dead. All hope is lost. All right? We just talked about that. This is the message. Jesus rose from the dead. Now, not just us modern people, but ancient people themselves thought this concept was, of course, exceedingly stupid. People don't raise from the dead. All right? Remember, ancient people are not morons, and they are totally aware of death and how it works and the fact that when you die, you don't come back. And yet, this was their message. And no one denies this. This was just the most singular event and the message about Jesus from that day forward. The whole New Testament is obsessed with this fact, or this proclaimed fact. You know, Christians believe it happened, but, you know, a lot of people don't. A lot of people aren't Christians. Some would even say they're Christians and still don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Not something I totally understand, but I know it's there. So, they, I lost my train of thought, sorry. But so, that's the message. That's what they keep talking about over and over, is Jesus was who he says he was because Jesus rose from the dead. That's why. That's why he is who he says he is. And that's why he is God's appointed Messiah, and that's why we must follow him. Now, of course, no historian denies this. And most historians don't even deny that some sort of thing happened. You know, it's becoming more popular to deny that Jesus, like, rose from the dead literally in the last, you know, a couple hundred years or so. But it's, you know, it's always been, some people denied it. But most admit that something happened. Now, there's some people out there that think, like, Jesus didn't even exist, and I'm not even going to dignify that. That's so stupid. It's just absurd. I mean, even people who are not Christians, like historians, know that this is absurd. But anyway, so the question is it really raising from the dead? Did Jesus really do that? And the thing about the message of the early Christians is that they are very clear, very, very clear, that they mean a bodily resurrection. They mean Jesus rose from the dead in his body. 1 Corinthians 15 is a particularly strong example of this, but it's all throughout. I mean, Jesus in the Gospels, he's proving to them that he's not a ghost, that he has his body. He eats pieces of fish. He has them touch him. So it's very clear that it's not just a resurrection, it's a bodily resurrection. He's not a ghost. He's not an apparition. So is this possible? Well, again, many say no. It's not possible. And it's a good reason. People don't rise from the dead. And it's pretty hard to falsify such a thing. Now, there's always a danger in trying to prove Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm not really trying to do that. If Jesus did not really raise... So here, let me level with you, right? So, it is my contention and my understanding of Christianity, and I'm, of course, representative of, you know, a lot of Christians, that Jesus' resurrection is absolutely essential, and if it didn't actually happen, I mean, Paul says this, right? If it didn't actually happen, Christianity is absolutely absurd. There's no truth to it. in any metaphysical sense anyway. And the whole thing falls apart. I mean, Christianity falls apart without the resurrection. And so I do believe it happened. I do believe Jesus actually bodily rose from the dead. And I'm not like ashamed of that, but it's important, that I be clear about, my beliefs and teaching the content of Christianity in an academic setting. But I want to tell you, like, this is kind of the crux of this lecture. No puns intended. But I'm not here trying to prove that Jesus rose from the dead in some sort of like historical fact or scientific fact. I don't think that's possible. What I can say is that there's really no good other theory that I have ever heard or can conceive of to explain what happens after Jesus' death. That's what I'm saying. Some people don't find that convincing. Some people find other theories actually convincing. And so maybe it's time to talk about those. One is that Jesus was resuscitated. Whether they went into the tomb and resuscitated him, or like I think one version was like the coolness of the tomb, which I think actually would be worse for you. But they said that it brought him out of shock or something. I think this is patently inconceivable because I'm sure they knew what a beaten dead man would look like, or almost dead man would look like. And all their message is about this glorified Jesus who is like doing all these incredible things. And so if you imagine Jesus showing up just bloody and beaten to hell, like, hey guys, I'm back from the dead. Do you guys have aspirin? Maybe a Band-Aid? It's just not conceivable to me. So I don't really get the resuscitation thing. There's the notion that there was a mass hallucination. Because, the thing is we've got more than one group, more than one person saying they see Jesus. And not just in the 40 days that he was supposedly risen and here on earth before he ascended into heaven. There's even like Paul later sees him, and Jesus appears to other people. And again, a mass hallucination is really, really difficult for me, whether it's drug-induced or the psychic horror of having Messiah killed. And I don't know if there's other like experiences out there that would... My understanding is nothing like that has ever happened before or since that we're aware of. But I also just, like, hallucinations, I don't know how they can all have a hallucination of such specificity and concord of detail and meaning. There's not people from the event within the couple generations after Jesus' death who are saying, no, I was there, he didn't raise from the dead, or he didn't raise from the dead like you say he did. It doesn't mean this. These details are wrong. There's some discrepancies in the empty tomb story, but they're like really, really minor. And, just not variations that I think suggest that these were not some sort of eyewitness accounts, or that they're lies. We'll talk about that more in a second. Probably the most popular one, let me get this one out of the way, is the idea that the body was stolen. And, that produces an empty tomb, but it doesn't produce all the stories afterwards. And there's one big reason that I'm mounting towards. I'm just talking about these reasons. There's one counter reason that I'm going to get to at the end of these. Probably the most popular, I would say, or prevalent theory, if you don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, is that they are having some sort of existential experience or metaphor for Jesus in heaven, that that Jesus lives on in our hearts and our minds and our spirits, and in that sense Jesus rose from the dead. And so the idea is the early Christians they're not saying like we really saw him, but they're saying that like Jesus is alive, Jesus' spirit is alive, and we are carrying on because we are his followers, and we become his church and his people. And so by carrying on his ministry, we are carrying on his life and his mission, and thus Jesus is alive and not dead in this sense. And that sort of amounts to the last one, which is the disciples lied. And in a sense, like, if that's what they're saying, I think they are kind of lying, because they're clear that they mean bodily resurrection. But also, it's not true. Jesus is not alive. If this is the case, if Jesus didn't bodily rise from the dead, he's not alive. And why come up with these theories anyway? I mean, to me, they're not at all cogent, but some do think they are, especially, like I said, the sort of like existential or spiritual experience one, the mystical sort of interpretation that Jesus isn't really alive, but he's alive in their hearts, or he's alive in heaven and has appeared to them. But the thing is why come up with these explanations anyway? Why not just say he just didn't raise from the dead? End of story. Well, because something happened. We'll get to ahead of past things. These people went out and risked their lives and lost their lives for this message. I mean, persecution was not as systematic as it would be in a few centuries. So don't get the sense that it was just like you were in constant threat when you were a Christian. Persecution would happen here and there and there and there and there and there and there. And there'd be decades and decades in between where there was no persecution whatsoever. Christians were always kind of viewed with suspicion, seemed like really odd bunch. They were not like the rest of the people. But, it's not like, being Christian was being like a, some sort of criminal. It would be criminalized at various points. And there were moments of really big periods of persecution, like under Nero or Diocletian. So it just kind of, it really depended. Or like what Pliny the Younger is doing under Emperor Hadrian in the very beginning of the 2nd century. He's saying that we've tortured them, we've killed them. They won't worship you, Caesar, and they won't stop believing in this Jesus guy. So the thing is that something happened that energized a movement that was so powerful that 2,000 years later, we are in this course on Christianity at a university dedicated to Jesus, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. What was it? And this movement was energized and moved forward in the face of constant and sometimes final persecution. From social ostracization to imprisonment, torture, to death. Why? Why do this? Well, they said it's because Jesus rose from the dead. And the thing is that we also need to understand that Jesus rising from the dead and then being God wasn't just like unlikely because it was scientifically problematic for the ancient world. As we'll talk about in the Incarnation, the notion that a man could be God was really stupid to the intelligentsia of the time. But also this notion that you would even want to be resurrected is a very, very Jewish thing, and it was not considered to be even desirable by a lot of, like a lot of the ancient philosophies and there's still philosophies and religions like this today, the idea is that you want to be free of the body. You don't want to be risen from the dead. You want to be resurrected. You want to be free of the body. You know? And then also, it, just like we talked about in the last lecture, it was ludicrous that God's messenger, God's Messiah, would be crucified. That doesn't make any sense. This is a piece of graffiti from the 2nd century, 3rd century. I'm not very good at my dates today. It was from Ephesus, on the side of a Colosseum wall. And if you can, it's hard to see, but you've got a guy, and he's worshiping. Then you have a man being crucified with the head of a donkey, of an ass. And it says here, Alexamenos worships his God. I mean, it's a graffiti that we have making fun of Christians and their stupid, stupid, stupid beliefs. They worship a crucified man. It's just dumb. It just looks so stupid. So, the thing about the message of the early Christians is that it's a really, really ludicrous, stupid, unlikely thing. And it's unlike any other religion, major religion, that's lasted for millennia has claimed. So, I don't see how any of this makes sense unless the last theory is true. And that's that Jesus rose from the dead. And I find every other theory utterly unconvincing. And I also find that if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, it's not just that, like, he's not Messiah. The whole theology of Christianity no longer makes sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, as we're going to talk about, particularly in the last lecture of this week, and then getting into the incarnation and the doctrine of new creation next week, if Jesus doesn't rise from the dead, Christianity it's just a big incoherent mess. So, yeah, I think Jesus really did rise from the dead. Now, if you're wanting to know more about this, I've briefly and kind of very cautiously summarized the arguments. There's a ton of literature out there, from not really scholarly to more scholarly. Of course, it's scandalous to anybody who doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, and that's fine. I don't really care about them. They can think whatever they want, but they're wrong. At least I think so. But anyway, probably most famously, and it's a really long, boring work, but N.T. writes the resurrection of the Son of God. It's huge. It's really boring. But that pretty much is the most comprehensive account of all the arguments for why Jesus really rose from the dead. So you can check that out. But from here on out, because this is a Christian course on Christian thought, we're going to proceed from the vantage point of Christianity that Jesus really rose from the dead. If he did or not, that's something that is not really the point of this class, and it's not really, that's up to you. You can think or not think it or whatever. But that Jesus rose from the dead is absolutely essential to Christian theology and Christian thought, and the reason why Christianity ever got off as a religion in the first place and why it's still around today. And so, that I think will do it. So now we're going to get into what the early church looked like, and I'll see you on the flip side.